monster soon.
Could make him 9 feet. Could be a giant.
Have you ever stared at a giant roadside statue and wondered if that thing could go toe-to-toe with Godzilla? What if the most American folk hero of all time, a lumberjack with an axe and a blue ox, actually ticks every box for being a full-blown, city-stomping kaiju? What if his casual playtime created mountain ranges, his footprints became 10,000 lakes, and he possessed a secret, god-level superpower that has been hiding in plain sight for over a century? We are talking about Paul Bunyan, the towering titan of the Northwoods, the Minnesota giant who might just be our very own king of the monsters.
What was that?
In this video, we are going to settle an absurd debate that tore my entire friend group apart, measure this legendary lumberjack against the literal definition of a kaiju, and finally reveal the hidden ability that pushes Paul Bunyan straight into divine monster territory. So let's start with the absolute basics, because before we can decide if a flannel-wearing giant qualifies as a kaiju, we need to know what a kaiju actually is. The word itself is Japanese, combining the characters kai, meaning mysterious or strange, and ju, meaning beast. For centuries, it was a catch-all term for the monsters and mythical creatures that populated ancient Asian folklore, the kind of things you would find lurking in old scrolls and whispered about around fires. But the modern meaning of kaiju was forged in 1954, when a little black and white film called Gojira hit Japanese theaters and introduced the world to Godzilla, the king of the monsters. That movie was not just entertainment. It was a primal scream born from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Godzilla was a walking metaphor for nuclear devastation, a force of nature that could not be reasoned with or stopped. After that cultural earthquake, the word kaiju came to mean something very specific and very powerful. The Wikipedia entry for kaiju gives us the crucial, defining language we need to use as our test. Kaiju are preternatural creatures of divine power. They are not just oversized animals or dinosaurs that happen to break buildings. The creators of Godzilla, including special effects master Eiji Tsuburaya and director Ishiro Honda, have been quoted repeatedly saying that a kaiju is more than merely a giant beast. It is the possession of special abilities or powers that pushes the creature beyond the limits of natural law and into something that feels almost godlike. Think about the classic examples. Godzilla does not just stomp, he breathes atomic fire that can level a city. Rodan does not just fly, he generates supersonic shockwaves that shatter everything beneath him. Mothra is a reborn goddess who embodies the spiritual consciousness of an entire civilization. Ghidorah shoots gravity beams from 3 separate heads. These are not mere biological traits. They are powers that break physics over their knee. Additionally, kaiju almost always serve as metaphors for real-world anxieties and forces bigger than any individual. Godzilla represented nuclear annihilation. Hedorah represented pollution. Biollante represented genetic engineering gone wrong. A true kaiju carries symbolic weight. So our test for Paul Bunyan is threefold. First, he must be non-human or at least non-ordinary in his biology. Second, he must be rooted in legend or serve as a metaphor for something larger than himself. And third, and most critically, he must possess some kind of preternatural, reality-defying power. If Paul clears all three, then the case is closed. Now let's rewind the clock way back to the mid-1800s, when Paul Bunyan was not a cartoon or a statue, but a living, breathing story told by men with sawdust in their lungs. The origin of Paul Bunyan did not happen in a writer's cozy study. It was pure campfire folklore, invented by actual lumberjacks in the logging camps of the Great Lakes region who spent their days felling ancient white pines, and their nights trying to outdo each other with the most outrageous tall tales they could invent. The earliest reliably dated reference to Paul Bunyan that researchers can verify comes from a logging camp north of Tomahawk, Wisconsin, during the winter of 1885 to 1886. The veteran loggers would spin yarns about the greatest boss logger who ever lived, piling on more and more ridiculous details with a straight face, while the greenhorn recruits fresh off the farm sat there wide-eyed, trying to figure out if any of this could possibly be true. This was a form of entertainment and hazing blended into one. Historians have debated where Paul's name and character actually came from. Some believe it evolved from the French-Canadian folk figure Bon Jean, whose name phonetically morphed into the more American-sounding Bunyan, which coincidentally echoes the Old French word bougne, meaning a large lump or swelling. Others point to a real-life lumberjack named Fabien Saginaw Joe Fournier, a tall, powerfully built man whose real exploits in the Michigan woods may have formed the gritty, factual nucleus around which all the later mythology crystallized. A third theory suggests that Paul Bunyan's stories are partially derived from tales of the French-Canadian folk hero Paul Bunyan, who fought in the Papineau Rebellion of 1837. The truth is probably a messy blend of all these influences. But regardless of the exact origin, by the time the first Paul Bunyan stories were published in the Detroit News-Tribune on July 24, 1910, by journalist James McGillivray, the giant had already stepped out of the bunkhouse and into the realm of pure mythology. The birth of Paul Bunyan, as told in the classic collections compiled by writers like Esther Shepard and James Stevens, makes it immediately obvious that this is not a normal human child. The legend tells us that it took 5 fully grown storks to carry the newborn Paul to his parents in Maine. Let that image sit in your mind for a moment. 5 storks, their wings straining, their beaks clenched with effort just to deliver one baby. And what a baby. According to the logging camp poets who sang his praises, infant Paul was already 10 axe handles high. Now we need to do some quick math. A standard logging axe handle in the 19th century measured approximately 36 inches, or 3 feet. 10 axe handles means newborn Paul Bunyan was roughly 30 feet long. He was the size of a small whale as an infant. His appetite matched his size, requiring dozens of barrels of food and milk every single day just to keep him from wailing. If his stomach was left empty for even a short while, the rumbling would cause small earthquakes that shook the timbers of the family home and rattled the dishes off the shelves. His parents, sensible folk who quickly realized their son could not be contained within the bounds of normal human society, made the difficult decision to move him deep into the unsettled wilderness of the north. Out there, with no neighbors to accidentally trample and no ships to sink with his bathwater splashes, Paul could finally stretch out and grow into whatever he was meant to be. It was out in that frozen frontier, surrounded by endless forests and skies that stretched forever, that Paul Bunyan found his life's calling and his truest companion. The story of how Paul met Babe the Blue Ox is one for the ages, unfolding during the legendary Winter of the Blue Snow. Now, the Winter of the Blue Snow deserves its own moment of appreciation because the details are so wonderfully absurd. It was a season so brutally, impossibly cold that the geese flew backward to keep the wind out of their faces. The fish migrated south by tunneling through the mud rather than swimming, and every spoken word froze solid in midair the instant it left your mouth. The lumberjacks had to thaw out their conversations the next morning over the fire just to hear what they had said the previous day. The snow itself was blue, stained by some strange atmospheric condition that nobody could explain and nobody bothered to question, because, in a tall tale, the snow being blue is just how things are. While walking through the blue-tinted drifts that reached all the way up to his knees, Paul heard a peculiar sound somewhere between a bleat and a snort. He looked down into a snowbank and saw a teeny tiny baby ox, completely blue from the freezing cold, hopping about and snorting with rage because he was too short to see over the drifts. Paul scooped up the little critter, carried him back to camp, and warmed him by the fire. But the little ox never lost that blue hue. The cold had stained him permanently, sunk into his hide and his coat, and so Paul named him Babe. Here is where the entire case for Paul Bunyan as a kaiju takes its most critical turn, so pay very close attention. Paul Bunyan's legend explicitly and repeatedly states that any animal raised in Paul's personal camp tended to grow to massive proportions. This is not a throwaway detail from a single obscure source. It is a consistent, recurring thread that runs through the entire tapestry of Paul Bunyan stories. Babe was just a normal ox calf when Paul found him, a shivering little thing that could fit in Paul's enormous palm. But under Paul's daily care and feeding, Babe grew and grew and grew until he was so vast that the space between his eyes measured 42 axe handles plus a plug of tobacco. The lumberjacks had to invent new ways to describe his size because normal units of measurement were completely useless. A murder of crows needed an entire day just to fly from one horn to the other. When Babe got hungry, he ate a ton of grain for a light snack. When he got itchy, he scratched himself against cliffs instead of trees, because any tree he leaned on would simply fall over and beg for mercy. And the oversized animal phenomenon did not stop with Babe. On a warm summer afternoon, Babe caught a glimpse of a pretty yeller calf grazing in a distant field, and it was love at first sight. He stepped over a mountain, introduced himself, and flatly refused to haul another log until Paul bought her from the farmer. Paul, ever loyal to his companion and probably amused by the whole situation, purchased Bessie the yeller cow. The moment she entered Paul's camp, the same thing happened. She began to grow. Her eyelashes became so long they could tickle lumberjacks on the far end of the logging camp. Her milk production was so enormous that Paul had to dig the St. Lawrence River just to keep the milk from flooding the entire region. This pattern is undeniable. Paul Bunyan has the consistent, documented supernatural ability to cause any animal he raises to grow to titanic, kaiju-level proportions. He turns ordinary creatures into monsters simply by being their caretaker. If Godzilla's atomic breath counts as a preternatural power that breaks the laws of biology and physics, then Paul Bunyan's growth-inducing presence surely counts as well. Now we need to talk about Paul's size and the absolutely insane feats of strength and landscape-altering power he displayed throughout his career. According to the classic measurement, a fully grown Paul Bunyan stood 63 axe handles high. Let us do the math again. An axe handle is roughly 3 feet, so 63 axe handles gives us a height of approximately 189 feet, though some sources round him up to an even 200 feet tall. To put that in perspective, the original 1954 Godzilla stood at about 165 feet tall. The 2024 MonsterVerse Godzilla is considerably larger at over 390 feet, but the original King of the Monsters was a shrimp compared to our lumberjack. So right out of the gate, Paul Bunyan has the size necessary to hang with the big boys. But size is only part of the equation. The real question is, what did Paul do with that size? The answer is that he remodeled the entire North American continent like a homeowner renovating a fixer-upper. When Paul walked across the wetlands of Minnesota, his giant footprints sank deep into the soft, muddy earth. Over time, those footprints filled with water and became the very lakes that the state is famous for today. The motto "Land of 10,000 Lakes" is literally Paul Bunyan's accidental landscaping. When Paul dragged his massive double-bladed axe behind him as he strode across Arizona, the blade carved a gash into the ground that deepened and widened over the miles until it became the Grand Canyon, one of the most iconic natural wonders on the entire planet. He did not sit down and plan to create a canyon. He was just walking, and his tool left a scar in the earth that millions of tourists now visit every year. When he needed a reliable waterway to ship his lumber to the coast, Paul personally dug the Puget Sound, and with the excavated dirt and rock, he piled up Mount Rainier as if it were a molehill, creating a 14,000-foot stratovolcano in a single afternoon project. Lake Michigan was nothing more than a watering hole he scooped out for Babe to drink from, a convenient backyard pond for a thirsty blue ox who could drain a river in one gulp. The mighty Mississippi River, that great artery of the American heartland, was created entirely by accident when Babe stumbled and overturned a water tank he was carrying, the sudden torrent carving a channel all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Yellowstone's magnificent waterfalls were positioned and shaped specifically so Paul could take a comfortable, refreshing shower after a long day of logging. The Black Hills of South Dakota became Babe's final burial mound when the great blue ox passed away, a monument of stone and pine forests marking where the most loyal companion in folklore was laid to eternal rest. The Missouri River, the Great Lakes, the Rocky Mountains, entire chapters of geography textbooks can be traced back to the casual, everyday activities of this one giant and his oversized pet. But the single most jaw-dropping feat, the one that really makes the mathematical comparison to modern kaiju absolutely laughable, involves something Paul and Babe did while they were just goofing around. On a lazy afternoon, these two giant friends were play wrestling. They were not angry. They were not in a fight to the death. They were rolling around in the dirt, laughing, having fun together the way a man might roughhouse with a big dog. And the sheer incidental force of their bodies colliding with the ground was so immense that the very stone beneath them crumbled and thrust upward, forming an entire new mountain range. That mountain range is the Grand Tetons, a jagged, dramatic spine of peaks that still towers over Wyoming today. Let that sink in for a moment. While playing accidentally without even trying, Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox created mountains. Now compare this to what modern cinematic kaiju do when they are actually trying to destroy each other. In the 2024 MonsterVerse movie Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, both Godzilla and King Kong stand well over 300 feet tall, and they absolutely go at each other with everything they have. They smash through cities. They topple skyscrapers. But watch the destruction closely and honestly. Several buildings take direct hits from tails, fists, and even the energy-charged axe, and many of them hold. They are damaged, cracked, crumbling, but they are not vaporized. They are not reduced to a mountain range. Paul Bunyan's casual, friendly roughhousing generated more profound geological alteration than modern cinematic kaiju can manage in combat. If we are being objective here, the math places Paul in a completely different weight class. His raw physical power scales far beyond what the kings of the monsters are currently displaying on screen. Now at this point, someone in the comments is definitely going to type, "But Paul Bunyan is a man. He looks human. A kaiju has to be a monster." And on the surface, that seems like a reasonable objection until you actually look at how Paul Bunyan is described in the stories. The source material is very careful and quite consistent on this point. Paul Bunyan is never described as a human. He is called humanoid or human-like, and those two words make all the difference in the world. Paul was not born a normal-sized baby who later got exposed to gamma radiation, a magic potion, or an alien symbiote to become large. He was, from the very first moment the storks delivered him, a giant. He was born enormous, born different, born as something that was never part of ordinary humanity. The legend even gives us a fascinating clue about his true origins. Those 5 storks that carried him to his parents in Maine, where did they come from? The stories tell us they came from across the Atlantic Ocean, specifically from the direction of Europe and Scandinavia. Think about the mythology of Scandinavia for a moment. That is the homeland of the Norse gods and their eternal enemies, the Jotnar, the frost giants, colossal beings with immense strength who were considered worthy adversaries for Thor and Odin. Paul Bunyan is not a mutated man. He belongs to the race of giants, the same mythic classification of beings that populates the oldest legends from cultures all around the world. And just as Godzilla is a giant prehistoric reptilian creature rather than a mutated iguana, Paul Bunyan is a giant rather than a large human. That distinction clears the non-human requirement with room to spare. The remaining kaiju criteria fall into place just as neatly. The definition states that kaiju must be rooted in ancient legend or serve as metaphors for larger societal forces, and Paul Bunyan absolutely crushes both of these requirements. He is one of the first true American folk heroes, a figure born entirely from oral tradition and the collective imagination of working-class immigrants rather than from any corporate marketing department or movie studio. In the dark, smoky bunkhouses of the 19th century, men from a dozen different countries, speaking a dozen different languages, all contributed to the growing legend of Paul Bunyan, layering their own cultural touchstones onto the story until it became something uniquely American and universally resonant. Paul Bunyan is to the United States what Hercules was to ancient Greece. A hero so impossibly strong and mythic that his exploits became a way for people to understand their own place in a vast, intimidating world. The symbolic resonance of Paul Bunyan is surprisingly layered and complex. On one hand, he can be read as the ultimate embodiment of the American dream and the frontier spirit, a man of immense capability who forges his own path through sheer hard work, loyalty to his companions, and indomitable will. On the other hand, he is undeniably a walking metaphor for industrialization and colonization, a force of nature who clears the ancient forests so that towns, railroads, and settlements can spread across the land. The Ojibwe people actually wove Paul Bunyan into their own cultural narratives, adapting him as a character and pitting him against their own hero Nanabojo in a 3-day battle for the forests of northern Minnesota. In that telling, Paul is an antagonist, a destructive giant who must be stopped to preserve the Red Lake wilderness. A lumberjack giant who can be interpreted as both an aspirational hero and an ecological cautionary tale, who appears in the mythologies of multiple cultures, is exactly the kind of thematically rich, metaphorically powerful kaiju that could walk straight into a Toho film and feel right at home beside Mothra and Biollante. So let us run down our final scorecard and see where Paul Bunyan lands. Is he non-human? Yes, definitively. He is a giant, a member of a separate mythic race, born enormous, and never identified as an ordinary Homo sapiens. Is he rooted in legend and metaphor? Absolutely. He is one of the most iconic folk heroes in American history, with a century and a half of oral tradition behind him, and his story carries deep symbolic weight about expansion, industry, and the cost of progress. Does he possess a preternatural power that defies the laws of nature? This is the knockout punch. Paul Bunyan has not one but two reality-breaking abilities. His raw physical strength is so far off the charts that his accidental play fighting can create mountain ranges, a feat that exceeds what modern cinematic kaiju can manage in life-or-death combat. And then there is his secret, passive superpower, the ability to make any animal he raises grow to kaiju size. He turned a normal blue ox calf into Babe, a creature so vast that crows needed a full day to fly from horn to horn. He turned a normal yeller cow into Bessie, a titan whose eyelashes tickled lumberjacks from a mile away. This is not a random detail. It is a consistent, documented pattern. Paul Bunyan can create giant monsters just by being a good pet owner. If Godzilla's atomic fire qualifies as a divine power, then Paul Bunyan's ability to grow giant animal companions surely makes the cut. Every requirement is met. Every box is checked. Paul Bunyan, the Minnesota giant, the towering lumberjack of the Northwoods, is officially, definitively, and gloriously a kaiju. He is the American king of the monsters, and he has been hiding in plain sight this entire time, looming over a forest in that image that tore my friend group apart. If this investigation made you look at roadside statues in a whole new light, Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel for more content that answers questions you never knew you had, and ring the bell so you do not miss the next one.